All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Chaf Zayin. We left off on Daf Chaf Vav Amid Beis under the Mishnah, beginning with the Gemara towards the bottom of the Amid, 5 lines from the bottom of the Amid. The Gemara is going to simply clarify that which we spoke about on the Mishnah, how certain Tanoim would eat even achilas arai in the sukkah. And as we mentioned, it's not that the Mishnah is telling us that they subscribe to an opinion that holds that you must, but they were going beyond the letter of the law. And there is some novelty in that because there are certain areas in halacha where we dafka don't advocate for people to be machmer. However, in this case, there is no inyan of looking like you're being haughty. And yes, go beyond the letter of the law if you so choose, and don't eat keminek Chabad or not even drink anything outside the sukkah. Now, on Daf Chav Zayin, Bechlal, we're going to be focusing on various chomur opinions of the Tana Rabbi Eliezer. Beginning with Rabbi Eliezer holds that there is a minimum amount of seudas that one must eat over the entirety of Sukkot. Don't forget that Midoraisa Sukkot is a 7-day holiday. And as we will learn the Mishnah, aside of the chiyuv of eating in the Sukkah on the first night, Rabbi Eliezer holds that in addition you have to eat, you're mechuyev to eat 14 meals over Sukkot. The Chachamim disagree with that. The other din that the Mishnah is quoting, Bishitas Rabbi Eliezer, and that is that if a person did not fulfill their obligation of having the first Seudah in the night of Sukkot, is there a concept of Tashlumin? Says Rabbi Eliezer, yes, you could, and therefore you should compensate for that meal. And what the Chiddush of Rabbi Eliezer is that this compensation, this Tashlumin, can even happen on Shmini Atzeres. Even though, guys, don't forget that Midoi Raisa, now in Eretz Yisrael, where Sukkot is only 7 days, Shmini Atzeres is a time in which we dafka don't eat in the sukkah. As we'll speak out, there's the inyan of Baal Tosef. Nevertheless, Rabbi Eliezer holds that you could compensate for the lack of eating the first meal, even on and including Shmini Atzeres. We're going to be focusing on the importance of eating. We'll explain during the Daf Al Pi Chasidus the inner meaning of eating, and why so many things in Yiddishkeit is, yes, dafka around a su'udas mitzvah. We will also learn in the Gemara a third shita of Rabbi Eliezer that a person may not change his sukkah during the entirety of Yantif. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer holds that a person must reside in the same sukkah for all of the 7 days. We're going to learn another shita of Rabbi Eliezer on Daf Chav Zayin Amid Beis that holds that a sukkah, shu'ulat's linked, is not going to be valid. In other words, even if you have permission to enter your friend's sukkah, you may not do so. You have to dafka dwell in your sukkah, similar to shita, to everyone's shita, benegei lulav the first day, that a lulav shu'ula will not be kosher. We're going to learn again about the mitzvah of chayiv adam lahakbol pnei rabbi beregel, and the last sugya of Chav Zayin Amid Beis, as the Gemara will clarify, even though initially we thought it was about Sukkot, will be about the Shaila that we spoke about when we learned Masechta Shabbos. Binyan is one of the malachas that is also Midai Raisa. Binyan Arai is something that's also Midrabanan. And the question that the Gemara will have is, if a person is adding to a temporary oil, it's not kavua, and you're not even making it, so to say, that prior to you putting the oil, the area was uncovered. An area is already covered, and you want to add to its cover in a temporary way. So there was a question asked to what Ashitas Rabbi Eliezer, and we'll see how Rabbi Eliezer had this ethic that if he did not hear something explicitly from his teacher, he would not publicly paskin, even though he had his own approach towards it, and a lot more. Again, Chevra, let us start on Daf Chavav Amid Beis, 5 lines before the bottom of the Gemara. Just quickly chazering on Daf Chav Hey. The Mishnah mentioned the third clause in the Mishnah that Oichlin v'Shoisin Arai Chutz L'Sukkah. Here on Daf Chavav Amid Beis, as we mentioned, the Mishnah spoke about a story both of Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai and of Rabban Gamliel, where they ate even what is defined as achilas arai dafke in a sukkah. And therefore the Gemara says, Maise, listoid, normally the Mishnah paskins a din, and then when it brings a story, the story is to substantiate, to show that indeed this din was followed through in a story. That's one of the ways that Rabbeinu HaKadosh is telling you that he paskins like that shita. But for the Mishnah to write a halacha and then to write a story that goes against the only halacha quoted in the Mishnah doesn't fit. And therefore, indeed, the Gemara clarifies that that even though you're not mechuyev to eat achilas aray in the sukkah, you are allowed to eat it chutz l'sukkah. But if you want to be machmer, okay, shkoyach, what's the chiddush? No, v'leis bei mishum yuhara. Sometimes we do say mechse ki yuhara. Looks like you're haughty. It looks like you're boasting. We don't say it over here. And to prove that there is no inyan of mechse ki yuhara, u'maisanami, that v'hiviu loy l'Rabbi Yechanan and Zakkai litoim esatavshul, they had some sort of cooked dish and they wanted him to taste it. And that's the concept of a snack. And another time they brought to Rabban Gamliel Shnei Koisovis 2 dates, Udalishal Maim and a bucket of water, Daf Chav Zayin, and Taka, you're not mechuyev to have it in the sukkah. Nevertheless, Va'amru, they said, Ha'alum l'sukkah, bring it up to the sukkah. The sukkahs then were generally on the rooftops, as we just learned, concerning the yichud with the Hassan. However, not everyone was machmer. And therefore, less than the amount of a kibetza. So here, the Mishnah is not only addressing him eating it outside the sukkah, but as we learned at the end of yesterday's shiur, he subscribes to the shita that you're not even mechuyev to do natilas yadayim. And the reason why he took the food b'mapa was simply for nekiyos, for hygiene, and he ate it outside the sukkah. And even though, yes, he made a prior bracha, because the bracha prior, brachas hanehen, is also a matir, and kol hanehen, we learned in Masechta Brachas, right? Without making a bracha, it's as if, God forbid, he's stealing from God Almighty. But when it comes to a bracha post, so miday raisa v'chalto v'savata. And then you have the two shiurim, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds only a kibetza. He subscribes again like Rabbi Yehuda, since he ate less than the kibetza, v'loi beirach achraf, he did not make birchas hamazon. Okay. Now the Gemara wants to understand something. If you remember on Daf Chavav, yesterday we had a machlokes between Abaye and Rabbi Yosef. How do we define the achilas aray? And it had to do with the quantity. Taka Rabbi Yosef said 2 or 3 eggs. Abaye said 1 egg. Even eating 1 egg is still achilas aray. Here the Mishnah is emphasizing that Rab Tzadok was given food less than an egg. So frek the Gemara, in other words, ha kebeitza boy sukkah. If it would have been in that amount, would he have to eat it in the sukkah? Would that take it over the line of achilas aray to achilas keva? Well, if that will be the case, so then lema to have it to yuftam. This is a Tanach, this is a Mishnah. It will refute both Rav Yosef, that speaks about the shiur of 2 or 3 eggs, still being achilas aray, only more is keva, and even Abaye, that says that a kibetza itself is still achilas aray. So answers the Gemara, 1 second. If the focus of the Mishnah only would have been regarding what is achilas aray, you're right. But since we also spoke about the concept of netilas yadayim, about making a bracha achrayna, so the Gemara clarifies, Dilma pachus mika beitzam, dafka, because it was less than an egg. That's why the netila, the washing of the hands prior to the eating of it, and ubracha, and the bracha post birchas hamazon, was not needed and therefore not made by Rab Tzadok. And you're right that what we should infer is if the food that would have been given to Rab Tzadok would have been exactly in the amount of a kibetza, then he would have to wash netilas yadayim. Then he would make a bracha post. But as far as whether he would have to eat it in the sukkah, no, maybe Rab Tzadok, even a kibetza, even washing netilas yadayim, even having to make a bracha, he would still be allowed to eat it outside the sukkah, even following shitas Abaye. And even more than that, even if you would have been given 2 or 3 eggs amount, he also, according to Rabbi Yosef, would have been allowed to eat it outside the sukkah. They don't all travel on the same track, and that's amazing. In other words, you're speaking about bread, you're speaking about someone who's washing and benching, and he's allowed to eat it outside the sukkah simply because of the quantitative amount, which still leaves it in the category of achilas aray. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nivadvar. All right, Chavre, let's buckle our seatbelts and let us fly. We are starting the Mishnah. Chavre, today's daf is Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer follows generally the shita of Beis Shammai. That's one of the meanings of Rabbi Eliezer Shamutehi. And indeed, as we see over here, that Rabbi Eliezer and all of the dinim that we will learn today is going to be more machmir, more stringent than the consensus, than the shita of the Chachamim. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Oimer, Arba esrei su'uda is 14 meals. Chayiv adam le'echol b'sukkah. A person is obligated to eat in the sukkah over the entirety of Sukkah, which is a 7-day Yom Tov. Yes, chutz la'aretz minhag avosenu b'yodeinu. We eat for 8 days, but the Mishnah is this is all the in Eretz Yisrael. And achas bayoim ba'achas balayla. How do you break down the 14 meals? One by day and one by night. Now the classical questions on the Mishnah is twofold. Number one, we have to eat 3 meals on Shabbos. We're not even speaking about the minhag of the Baal Shem Tov and minhag Chasidim that we eat 3 meals on Yom Tov. Especially the last day of Yom Tov, we, Chabad Chasidim, we have a 3rd meal. We bench dafka into after it's dark. But if you have to have 3 meals on Shabbos and 7-day Sukkahs will always have a Shabbos in it, well, isn't that 15 meals? Kasha number 1. Kasha number 2 is, by Yidden, the night starts before the day. The Seder of the Mishnah should have been, Achas balayla va'achas bayoim, says the Cheshek Shloima. One question answers the other. And as we will see from the sheet of the Chachamim, that they don't subscribe to anyone being obligated to eat a meal over the whole Yom Tov, other than the first night. So Rabbi Eliezer is not talking about the first night. Rabbi Eliezer is beginning to speak about the first daytime of the first day of Sukkot. Achas bayoim va'achas balayla. And if you only start counting the meals from the day of the first day, indeed, you have 14 meals, because really you have to have 15 meals. But the first night is a different geder, as we'll speak out in a moment. Okay. Now, the Chachamim say, they argue with Rabbi Eliezer, they hold ein ledavar kitzba, there is no limit, meaning, aside of the first night, you're not obligated to have any meal during Sukkot. Now, is he speaking about, what about, isn't there an obligation to eat a meal over Yom Tov? We're not focusing on the Yom Tov obligation, we're speaking about the Sukkah obligation. In other words, a person, let's go back to our Teishvu Ke'ein Toduru. When a person is in their home, people eat when they want to. In your home, when you feel hamish, you eat when you desire to eat. You don't feel obligated to eat. Now, of course, if a person wants to have 14 meals, if you want to have 80 meals, knock yourself out. But if you only want to eat a snack, and we just established that a snack does not need to be eaten in a sukkah. So if a person's habit is, I really enjoy having 20 snacks a day, then you're not mechuyev to have a single meal as far as sukkah is concerned. The Torah is telling you that if you'll have a meal, you have to have it in the sukkah. You're not mechuyev to have any meals. But that is only true concerning all of Sukkot aside of the first night. Chutz milele Yom Tov shel Chag Bilvad, that there is a special limud, as the Gemara will tell us, that you are obligated to eat a meal on the first night of Sukkot. And obviously, if you're mechuyev to eat a fixed meal, then that meal must be eaten in a sukkah. Mamash fits. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim are not debating the first night. So Rabbi Eliezer is not addressing the first night. After the first night, again, Rabbi Eliezer will hold 14 meals. Another machlokes. Rabbi Eliezer, and as we'll see, one is linked to the other. It's just going to be in a very difficult way. Or whether you're greatest or not, if you didn't eat that chiyuv meal that everyone subscribes to. So there are certain mitzvahs that if I fail to keep, I can't compensate, right? If a person misses a shema, mu'uvas asher lo yuchal liskoy, is there tashlumin, is there compensation for this first chiyuv meal? Says Rabbi Eliezer, yes. And you know what his chiddush is? Not only can you compensate this meal during the Yom Tov of Sukkot, during the 7 days, which will make your compensation meal like the obligation meal, because you'll have to eat it in the sukkah, you can even compensate it on Shmini Atzeres, which is huge, because Shmini Atzeres is a time in which one is not allowed to eat in the sukkah, l'shem mitzvah sukkah. Yashlim leili Yom Tov v'achrin shel Chag. Wow. Okay. And then this is going to be a problem. In other words, as the Gemara will speak out, we'll have to explain Rabbi Eliezer. And the Chachamim here again disagree. Even if you missed the one chiyuv meal, according to the Chachamim, well, too late. Ein ledavar tashlumin. There is no compensation. You missed it. And ba'alzen, towards these types of positive mitzvahs, obligations, that Shlomo HaMelech say in Koheles that it's mu'uvas, that lo yuchal liskoin. There are certain twisted things that cannot be made straight, or v'chesron lo yuchal imonis. That which is missing cannot be counted. you cannot fix it. And again, we're going to go more in the Gemara and see how these two topics are very much connected one with the other, but in a very problematic way. On Shitas Rabbi Eliezer, it almost appears like he's contradicting himself, as the Gemara will explain. Okay, so first of all, let's focus on the first topic of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says that a person is obligated to eat 14 meals on Sukkot. Where do we get it from? My Talmud Rabbi Eliezer. Back to the Teishvu Ke'en Toduru, answers the Gemara, Teishvu Ke'en Toduru. Sukah is Teishvu. Teishvu means you should dwell the way you live in your home, just like people regularly in the times of Chazal. Where did we learn this, my friends? We learned this in Yuma, in the Sugya of Man. That prior to the Man, we were eating like the way Tarnagoyim peck in the garbage. We keep on snacking. Moshe Rabbeinu taught us proper etiquette, which is to eat 2 meals a day. And that's the way from then on until not that long ago. That was the minig of the Yidden. Achas b'yom v'achas b'layla. Have a meal in the morning, have a meal at night. So af sukkah, you have to live in the sukkah the way you live at home. Achas b'yom v'achas b'layla. And what about the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan not only agree with the Teishvu Ke'en Toduru, but they use the Teishvu Ke'en Toduru to argue with Rabbi Eliezer. Indeed, you have to dwell in the sukkah the way you behave in your dira. Ma dira, even if people do bepoil eat 2 meals a day, but they do not do it as out of obligation. Ma dira, if you desire, you eat. You're at your home. Be at home. Feel at home. Av sukkah, of course, in bayachal. But ibaya lo yachal. Now comes the question, if that's the case, so why did the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Eliezer? Why does everyone agree that the first night there was an obligation? Why? In your house, you don't feel obligated? So here, there's another limud. It's a separate limud. And it's Gzeira Shava. It says here, meaning here by Sukah is Chamisha Asar. And the Torah uses the same words, Chamisha Asar b'chaga Pesach, b'chaga Matzos. I'm sorry, what we call Pesach, what God calls Matzos. Mala, how long? Just like when it comes to the obligation of eating a matzah. Guys, we had this in Psachim. Only the first night is when we have a chiyuv to eat. It begins with 1 kezayis, then it grows a beard, right? If you make a ka'ara, you have to have ideally 5 kezesim, right? 2 by the mitzvah chilas matzah, 2 by the afikoimen, and 1 with the sandwich, a filo. But far after the first night, if you want to eat a grain product, then it should be matzah. But you're not mechoyev to eat matzah. Afkan, lailo harishon chayvam. You're mechoyev to eat, again, a meal, which would automatically mean, by default, you have to eat it in the sukkah. Bikan ve'elach, and afterwards, fakert, use the Gzeira Shava, not only Teishvu Ke'en Toduru, use the Gzeira Shava to teach you Bikan ve'elach rishus. Now, how do you know that by Pesach you're not obligated to eat beyond the first night matzah? So we learned Amar Kra. Let me just give a little bit of an intro, guys. We had this in Psachim. The Torah writes in one pasuk, for 7 days you should eat matzah. The Torah writes in another pasuk, Sheishas Yomam Toichal Matzos. And that, if you remember, is mamish one of the applications of the 8th klal or the 8th midah of the Yud Gimel midos, called the V'shoy B'chlal. The Yotza called Lamed. Remember, Loi Lamed Alatzman Yotza El Lamed Kol Kol Yotza. In other words, if God says eat matzahs for 7 days, then God says eat matzah for 6 days, which means God wrote a pasuk to tell you that the 7th day you're not mechuyev. You could, and if you eat again a bread product that has to be matzah, it can't be chametz stick, but you're not mechuyev. So that's the rule, that if God made a rule and then something was excluded from the rule, that 7th day is not the only day that's being excluded. All of the days are being excluded. So if that's the case, maybe you should never be mechuyev to eat matzah. So that's why Amar Kraba Erev Toichlu Matzahs and Parshas Boy, that's a separate obligation. The first night you have to eat matzahs. Hakosov Kavoi, that the first night is a chayva. So it'd be interestingly, in other words, now it comes out that the Hashitas Chachamim is not only based on the Teishvu Ke'en Toduru. They're just telling Rabbi Eliezer that your limud should go in the opposite way. That really the Chachamim use the Gzeira Shava to teach you both in him. You're mechuyev to eat a meal on the first night. You are not mechuyev to eat any meals during the remainder of Sukkot. Yes, whenever you opt in to eat a su'udah, it must be in a sukkah. But to say that you're mechuyev, you're only mechuyev on the first night. Now, more about this machlekes when we're going to go into the second. What was the second in the Mishnah? That Rabbi Eliezer said that if a person missed out the first night, they can compensate it even on Shmini Atzeres. Now the Gemara is going to point out that one Rabbi Eliezer actually contradicts the other. Fragt die Gemara, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Arba Esrei Seudos Chayv Adam Lechol Besukah, Achaz Bayoim, Va'achaz Balayla. Oh, so what's the Shaila? Let me explain the question. If the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer is going to tell you, which is what we said above, that why are you chayiv 14 meals? Because of the pasuk basukos teishru, that's the teishru kein taduru. But don't forget the words basukos. Then there should be a greater link between these suudos and basukos. Basukos teishru. How can you allow for someone to compensate a meal that God writes in the Torah basukos? How can you eat it outside the sukkah? This question is not a lefiyah chachamim. That means if the chiyuv of eating, let's say, would come from the Gzeira Shava, the Gzeira Shava doesn't address an inherent obligation of eating in the sukkah. All we learn from the Gzeira Shava is that there is a chiyuv to eat a meal. Now, there is a halacha. The halacha is that on sukkahs, if you eat a meal, it has to be in the sukkah. So if the limud would have been from the Gzeira Shava, it would have been a lot easier to explain Rabbi Eliezer. The limud, the chiyuv, is not coming from a pasuk that is emphasizing basukos. So there's a chiyuv to eat a meal. If you're going to say that you can compensate it even on Shmini Atzeres, because as we'll learn, that for certain dinim Shmini Atzeres is a chag b'fnei atzmai, right? Psar kshav. But that also implies that for other dinim, Shmini Atzeres could be viewed as a continuation of Sukkot. It's actually called the eighth. The eighth from what? It's not number 1, it's day number 8. But dafka on Rabbi Eliezer, since you said his sources from basukos teishru, which would link the meals in basukos, so Rabbi Eliezer will allow you to compensate outside the sukkah. That's the way we learn Pshat in the Gemara. So explains the Marshal. So Amar Bira, Amar Rav Ami, Mamish, guys, listen to this. Chazar boy Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, by writing in one Mishnah 2 dinim of Rabbi Eliezer, expects us to realize this, that Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind. He retracted his opinion. He no longer subscribed to the obligation of eating 14 meals in the sukkah. He continuously agrees with the Chachamim that the first night there is a chiyuv to eat in the sukkah, and that does not come from the basukos teishru, that dafka comes from the Gzeira Shava. So now it works. No, it's since the chiyuv of the meal is not directly from a pasuk that emphasizes the dwelling in the sukkah. So Rabbi Eliezer holds you're mechuyev to eat a meal compensated over Yantiv, and that will even include Shmini Atzeres. And actually, as Rashi points out, the machlekes will be, so why will the Chachamim disagree with that? It has to do with the way we are able to compensate for a korban chagiga that one should bring on the first day, but if one didn't, until when can you compensate it? Do we compare it to the chagiga? Do we not compare it to the chagiga? Okay. Now, the Gemara adds, Mashlam b'mai, when you speak about a compensation meal, exactly how will you compensate? If you're going to compensate it berifta, by having a meal that consists of bread, which is a halachic meal, hold on, Shmini Atzeres is Yantiv. In other words, I get it. Now that you say that Rabbi Eliezer retracted, now that we said that on Chol HaMoed you're not mechuyev to eat a bread meal, so compensation will mean you're mechuyev to eat a meal on the first night. If you didn't eat it on the first night, eat a meal during the remaining of Sukkos. And that's called compensation, because if you would not be compensating, you would not be obligated to eat a meal. But if you are allowing this person to make tashlumin even on Shmini Atzeres, the Gemara is taking it as a given that you're not going to eat another meal on Shmini Atzeres. We're speaking here about eating the meal of Shmini Atzeres. Well, that's not tashlumin. That's the chiyuv of Shmini Atzeres. Su'uda diyoyma ka'achel. In other words, Shmini Atzeres requires a meal because it's Shmini Atzeres. And therefore, elamai yashlim, that yashlim could mean, I'm saying could as we'll speak out in a moment, b'mine targima. Mine targima means with different types of refreshments. Rashi gives examples. Tosfos gives examples. Rashi speaks about peiros, fruits, vikisnin, pastries, right? Pasaba vikisnin. And vikafloitois mivusholos, cooked vegetables or cooked leeks. In other words, you can compensate by adding to the Shmini Atzeres meal some additional nice refreshment. And that's called compensation for the fact that you didn't eat the meal on the first night, and even though you were not eating it in the sukkah. Okay. Tanya Namiyachi. Now here the Braisa adds the words im hishlim. Im hishlim, Rashi teaches, if you decide to compensate, not by having another meal on Shmini Atzeres, if you only want to compensate by adding to the meal, oichet gut. B'minei targima, yatsa. Oh. And that's the whole topic that many people quote from this Braisa, the way Rashi explains it. In other words, what we are now learning is that if you want, you can compensate by having a meal back to back. You can have a meal on Shmini Atzeres, and then you can have another meal on the night or whatever to compensate for the Laila Harishan of Sukkahs. And the question is, will that be considered the bracha levatala? Like, could a person eat and wash and bench, knowing that they're going to have another meal? Is there an issue with that? Is there no issue with that? Obviously, Rashi understands that this Braisa subscribes that there's absolutely no problem with it. The chiddush is that you don't need to make a second meal. You can simply make an add-on. You can make, add pastrami to the kiddush. You can do something that otherwise you would not have done, and that is the kavana to be mashlim for the first su'udah that you missed out. Okay. Says the Braisa, Sho'al apitrupus shel agrifas hamelach. The apitrupus, the overseer or the administrator of King Agrifas, asked the Tana Rabbi Eliezer, Kigoyin ani, someone like me, she'eni rogel le'echol elasuda achas bayom. His body got used to eating one meal in 24 hours. Guys, this question was asked before Rabbi Eliezer retracted his opinion. Can I now, like, in other words, he was basically telling Rabbi Eliezer, I don't understand your opinion. I every day eat one meal. So someone like me, that's my ke'en toduru. And again, before Rabbi Eliezer retracted, he did not like that. And Omar Loi, Rabbi Eliezer tells this apitrupas, I don't understand. Every single day. True. You know your habit is to have one meal a day. But at the mamshich kamar parparois l'kavadatzmacha. Right? There are times that you do choose to whet your appetite. You guys, it's interesting. In Yiddish, they say that eating brings the appetite. And that's the nature. When a person is not in the mood of doing something, many times, start doing it, and then you'll get the appetite to do it. So what would happen if you would decide to have a meal? Because you want to have another meal. And if you would not feel an appetite, then you would eat parparois. You would whet your appetite, and then you would eat another meal. In other words, if you would want to eat another meal, you would figure out how to eat it with pleasure. So why don't you do that for God? Now, to give more honor to your Creator, to our Creator, right? Baruch Koinech. It goes to the world of Atzilus. What you're not going to take from your parparois that you would have eaten during the year, save it for Sukkahs, eat something that will open up your appetite, and then eat another meal, eat 2 meals a day. In other words, what Rabbi Eliezer is telling him is that there is some importance in eating a seudah. And indeed, many people say this in a way that they don't understand, but they just observe that a lot of Judaism has to do around food. And there's a reason for that. And there's a reason for that, that everyone spoke about the reason why when we make a siyum, we have to have a seudah and the importance of it. Because since the ultimate purpose of all of Yiddishkeit is to bring the Shekhinah down over here, which is why the majority of mitzvahs are of physical nature, because you're bringing godliness in a physical act. But even when you put on tefillin, and tefillin is something physical, the fact that God obligated you to put on tefillin, so you're not really making a dira betachtoinim. You're not bringing God into the lowest part of the world. You're bringing God into the mitzvah part of the world. The ideal is to take a activity that otherwise would have been classified as reshus. Eating, and there's nothing better than eating. Eating is like the face of physical activity. And using that in the service of God is the greatest way of making a dira b'tachtonim. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, again, this is before he retracted. He holds that there is an obligation to eat, but there is an importance of using a physical activity a human activity, eating in the service of God. So no, I don't accept the fact that since you normally only eat one meal a day, you can be yotzei. No, dafka, make an effort to whet your appetite. And that's not
he's not telling him you're obligated. He's telling him brechach habissol.
No, there has to be he's obligated because Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah said you're obligated, Samach. And if Rabbi Eliezer would have retracted, Rabbi Eliezer would have responded to the apitrupas. Yitaka don't have to. Okay, right. Furthermore, another conversation. Another question that was asked today.
I heard today that some Rishonim hold if you don't sleep in the sukkah, you're not yotzei.
Is that true? We heard from the Apitrupas.
Is that true?
Let's go weiter.
No response? Okay.
Now listen to this. He had two wives. And as we'll see in a moment, Rabbi Eliezer holds that you have to dwell in the same sukkah for all of 7 days. Why does he say so? The Havamina is Teshvu ke'ein toduru. Just like a person, you have one home, you dwell in your home, dwell in your sukkah. If that would have been the reason, then how would we apply it to a man who has two wives? This is at the times that one was allowed to have two wives. And then you can argue that just like a man who has two wives who dwell some days with one, some days with the other, so then the Teshvu ke'ein toduru will allow even Rabbi Eliezer to dwell in more than one sukkah. And one lived in Tefilla, and one lived in Sipoidi. That's like Milsa Agav Urcha Kamashval. And if you have two wives, smarter for them not to be in the same city. And the Yeshli Shtei Sukkos, therefore, Achas B'Tver, Achas Sipoidi. Mao, am I allowed? She'etzei misukkah l'sukkah ve'ipot. Can I fulfill my obligation? And the question again was based on the Havamina that Rabbi Eliezer's shita is based on Teshvu ke'ein toduru. And Amar Loi responds Rabbi Eliezer to this apitrupas, Loi, you may not do so. The reason why I subscribe to one's being obligated to spend all of the 7 days in the sukkah, it's not because of the Teshvu ke'ein toduru. Why you will see in the top of the base. It's not because of that. And therefore, Sha'ani Yomer, even in your case, I will tell you that Kol hayotzim sukkah l'sukkah, if you change sukkahs, you own both. You have families in each one. Nish good. Bitel mitzvasa shol rishono. Now listen to these words. You lost the first mitzvah. You know what it means you lost the first mitzvah? Rabbi Eliezer is so machmer. He's not only saying that now that you changed, right, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, you were in the first sukkah. Wednesday, you went in sukkah number 2. Wednesday, you did not fulfill your obligation. That's not what he's saying. He's saying bitel mitzvasa shol rishono. Look inside Rashi, the second to last line in the Amid. Afilu yamim she'avru alef kvar ibdan lemafreya. Wow, ve'einoi mitzvah. If you don't stay in the same sukkah for all of the 7 days, you retroactively lost the mitzvah that you potentially would have been doing when you began sitting in the sukkah. Wow. And indeed, Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Daf Chav Zayin Amid Beis, that ein yotzin misukkah l'sukkah. You cannot change sukkahs. Look inside the top Rashi. Whether it is lechol b'zu v'lishan b'zu, whether it is eating in one and sleeping in the other, or whether it is that you're going to do everything that you do in your home in a sukkah, 24/7 in one. Means you'll eat in sukkah number 1, you'll sleep in sukkah number 1, you'll make your headquarters in sukkah number 1, and then in the next day you'll go to another one. Also not good. Can't do that. And therefore, based on the same concept, as we'll see more in a moment, that Rabbi Eliezer holds that the validity of the sukkah is contingent on it being your home for all of the 7 days. If someone did not reside in the sukkah for the first days of Yom Tov, now building a sukkah on Chalamoid is the big topic here. Are you allowed to build it? Are you not allowed to build it? Or you allowed to build it permanent? You're allowed to build it temporary? The whole sukkah is temporary. Forget about the whole concept of working on Chalamoid. Even if you were building a sukkah on Chalamoid is a loser from the beginning. Because the very fact that the sukkah was not there for all 7 days makes the sukkah invalid. How?
So according to Rabbi Eliezer, you're not allowed to travel during sukkah?
According to Rabbi Eliezer, you're not allowed to travel during sukkahs. Now, if a person traveled for a trip of a
you can't even have a meal at your friend's house, it sounds like.
What was that?
You can't even have a meal at your friend's house. It sounds
You
like
cannot have a meal in your friend's house. Correct. I'm saying if a person happens to be in a location where they are exempt from being in a sukkah cave, and that's different, then they are exempt. But if there is an obligation to be in a sukkah, then they have to go back to their first sukkah. And b'chachamim oimrim, one again connected to the other, yoitzin misukkah l'sukkah. And therefore, since you don't have to dwell in the same sukkah for all of the 7 days, you could make a brand new sukkah on chayla shel moed. And so we paskin. Now, the Shavin both agree, side Rabbi Eliezer and side the Chachamim, she'im nafla, that if you built a sukkah, but your sukkah collapsed, and you want to rebuild the same one, that's okay, even according to Rabbi Eliezer. And there's a big chiddush to that, as the Gemara will explicitly point out. But before we get into the last clause of the Braisa, let's first see the source of Rabbi Eliezer. It says the Gemara, "My time of Rabbi Eliezer, Amar Kra," since it says in the 8, Chag HaSukkah is Tasalocha Shivas Hayamim. Taiches Rabbi Eliezer Asay Sukah Haruya L'Shiva. One must erect a sukkah that is ru'uya. Guys, ru'uya doesn't mean what it normally means. Normally, the word ru'uya means fit, potentially fit. Here, ru'uya means a sukkah that is actually used for all of the 7 days. And the Rabbanan say, no, hachi ka'amar Rachmanan. I say the opposite. Make a sukkah anytime during the 7 days. Don't tell yourself that since I missed out the first day or today, chutzla, 2 days. So I lost my mitzvah. No. Any time during Yontif, make yourself a sukkah. You didn't sit on Yontif. Well, going forward, build yourself a sukkah on Chalamoid. Now, Vishavin quoting the Braisa that she'im nafla shechayzer aboyna oiseh b'chal hashamoid pshita. The Gemara says that's not a pshita. I'll tell you why it's not a pshita. Now that we established that Rabbi Eliezer holds you mamish have to be in the same sukkah for all 7 days, how do you view a building that collapsed? Even if you rebuilt it exactly as it was, is that an old building or is that a new building? Mal the Tamer, one might have thought, hayachriti, it's a new building. And therefore, it's not the Lashiva, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer will say that, you lost your mitzvah, you might be an oinus, you might be a shoygig, but you don't get the mitzvah. Kumash Malan, that we view it as the original one. And how meaningful this is concerning the building of the third Beis HaMikdash. It's when you build a building to replace, the Rebbe spoke about Bayis HaMeshulash. Bayis HaMeshulash means that the third temple will actually be a continuation of the first. There's going to be aspects of the first that will be in the third. There's going to be a continuation of the second in the third, and there'll be the novelty of the third. But it's not something mamish new. It's like the old and the new together. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer.
Rabbi, what's the Havamina according to Rabbi Eliezer? What would your other option be? You have no sukkah now, so what should you do?
You can't do anything.
Your sukkah collapsed. Your thought is like...
No. Rabbi Eliezer says that you could. The Havamina would have been that you lost a mitzvah. It happens. What does a Jew do if they don't have a lulav and an esrog? What did our grandparents do in Siberia when there was no matzah? What should they do?
You go and you get one if you can. So here,
but you can't. You can't. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Oimer. Kashem she'ein adam yoytzi yedei chavasa b'yom tevrishon shel chag bilulavi shel chaverim. Mamash, who just said it, Samach just said, you cannot go into your fellow sukkah. And everyone subscribes, and we'll learn a lot about this, guys, in the next chapter, that even if you take your fellow's lulav with his permission, you are borrowing it, you will not fulfill your obligation of taking a lulav on the first day of Sukkot. You have to own it. It has to be yours. And everyone agrees to that. And what is that based on? The pasuk in Emer Dichsiv, ulakachtem lochem. Take yours, even though literally it means take for yourselves, but take that which is yours. By your Marishan on the first day, pri, the fruit of a beautiful tree, and kapis tamarim, and the branch of a date palm, etc. And Chazal say that from the word lochem, we learn mishel lochem, from your possession. And even a lulav she'ula is not valid. Kach, similarly, holds Rabbi Eliezer, ein adam yotzi yedei chavasa, a person cannot fulfill his obligation of dwelling in a sukkah if the sukkah does not belong to you, even if they gave you permission. Again, the same limud, because since it says chag sukkah is taseh l'cha, same thing. Shivas yamim Taichus Rabbi Eliezer Lecha means Mishelecha. It has to belong to you.
Could you make a kinyan?
Can you make a kinyan? Even by a lulav, you can make a kinyan. You can acquire it. But it has to be yours. But if you'll acquire the sukkah, then he won't own it. Now, what about a sukkah that belongs to partners? We'll get to it just in a moment. Yes, of course, lulav, you have to own it. Even a lulav she'ula, even a borrowed lulav is not good for one's fulfillment of the first day. However, unlike lulav, sukkah is different. You could fulfill your obligation, even though it does not belong to you. And where do they get that from? Why don't they interpret the locha as they interpret the lochem? There's a reason. Because concerning sukkahs, there's another pasuk, and we have to reconcile them. What's the other pasuk? It says in Emoy, Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu b'sukkos. All of the citizens of Yisrael should dwell. Now, guys, I know that in our Gemara, ironically, the word sukkos is spelled with vavs, but really in the Chumash, this word, which is pronounced in the plural, basukos, it's spelled, the Mesoides, not the Mikra, is without vavs. And as we already had in the beginning of this Masechta, that when we focus on the way the words, the letters are written in the Torah, whenever sukkah is written without a vav, it implies a singular sukkah. So basukos should be read basukas, or it should be understood as one. All of the Yidden are dwelling in one sukkah. And Milamed, and that teaches you, Shekol Yisrael Ru'uyim Leishav Sukkah Achas. That, it's a technical challenge of how to get all the Jewish people into one sukkah. But even the better, or at least here, it's permissible. Now, let me explain like this. When it comes to halachic ownership of things, if you are the only owner, we won't hold that if the item has less than a pruta of value, you don't own it. You do own it. If someone, God forbid, will steal something that is yours, they're stealing. You cannot take them to Beis Din if it's less than a pruta. But you own it and they did an act of theft. But that's only when you are the sole owner. Then ownership is not contingent on its value. However, when you have partnerships, this is important. Certainly our Gemara is ascribing to this concept that if neither partner, if the partner doesn't own at least a pruta's value, they're not real owners. If all the Jewish people were to dwell in one sukkah, let's say they all participated in its costs. So you're going to have, today 14 million, 18 million Jews dwelling in a sukkah. No matter who's doing the building project, a sukkah at the end of the day is not a mikvah. How much will it cost already? It's not going to be, at least in the times of the Gemara, a property, a building that you can argue that every Jew owns a pruta amount. It's not going to be a $30 million project. In other words, every Jew will own less than a pruta. When it comes to shutfis, that means you don't really own it. If you're not mechuyev to own it, which is a sheet of the Chachamim, then it fits. But if Rabbi Eliezer would have been right, then no one will fulfill their obligation, because then no one would be a real owner. It won't be stolen, but it won't be lochem. Therefore, you are mechuyev to interpret the lacha by sukkah is not the way you interpreted the lochem by lulav. V'rabanan, hi lacha my darshi bei. Now that the Chachamim say, okay, because of the kol ezrach, the lacha doesn't exclude she'ula, indeed, but the lacha does exclude. You know what it excludes? It excludes a stolen sukkah. Aval she'ula, no, it says kol ezrach. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, how does he understand the kol ha'ezrach ma'yavidlei? Because he cannot interpret it that all of the Yidden should actually dwell in a sukkah. That won't be allowed according to Rabbi Eliezer. You have to own it. Another din, we're going to focus on the word kol. Kol means all. All means even if you have someone who converted during Yontif. Even if you have a minor that became a bar mitzvah during Yontif. What are we saying? What does Rabbi Eliezer hold? That it's all or nothing, right? All or nothing. You got to sit all the 7 days. And therefore, like Danny said, and if you don't have it for the first day or two, you lost it. So think about it. What happens if someone becomes a Jew during Yontif? If someone becomes an adult during Yontif, during Cholam middle. So that's what God is adding, that since you were not even obligated prior to the 4th day of Sukkot, you should build and you'll be keeping all of your yontif. The word kol is going on every single citizen, even the one that only became a mechuyev during and middle of Sukkot. That will be the exception, but it's not really an exception, because what we are saying is that during the entirety of the time of the obligation, you must dwell in the same Sukkah. Okay, so during the entirety of this year's Sukkot, which this guy became bar mitzvah only on the third, fourth day, he's going to dwell for what is for him, his entire Sukkot in the same Sukkah. However, the Rabbanan will agree, but the Rabbanan don't need to have a special limud for that. They go l'shitasam kiven she'amru oisin sukkah b'chol shel mayit. So I don't need to have a pasuk to tell me that you allow someone to build a sukkah during chol hamayit, and therefore they have to use the kol ha'ezrach fakert to tell you literally that all of the Yidden can dwell in one sukkah, which means that as partners you don't really own it, which proves that you don't need to own it, and the lacha of sukkahs only excludes a stolen sukkah. More details of what's called a stolen sukkah. If it's the karka ain't an exelis. We're going to learn more about this, God willing, in the next Pedic. Let's go back. Tana Rabbana. Maise berabi Eloi. Shahalach lahagbel penei Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Eloi. Went to spend, went to receive, went to greet his great teacher Rabbi Eliezer, who was then in Lloyd for the regal of Sukkot. So Amar Loi, Rabbi Eliezer, he's a Shammai, he's Gevura. He tells us Talmud, not Shalom Aleichem, how beautiful it is that you came to honor me for Yom Tov. He told him, Eloi, Eincha mishoifsei haregel. By you leaving your family, your wife for Sukkot, you are not from those who are fulfilling the obligation of celebrating Yom Tov. Rabbi Eliezer was against one leaving one's home for Sukkot. Shahoya Rabbi Eliezer Oimer Mishabeach Ani Eso Atzlanim. There is one time in the year that I actually praise the lazy ones, and that is over Sukkot. She'ein yoitzim mibatayim beregel. In other words, they remain home with their wives. And indeed, as it says in Parshas Re'eh v'Samachta, you know where Ato uveisachom, Uvaldik. In other words, guys, aside of the fact that you have to dwell in the same sukkah, I think it's much more than that, because since, as we'll learn in a moment, that you're obligated lahagbul pnei rabbi and oisik mitzvah patam and mitzvah, there's another inyan. There's an inyan of the samachta ato beisecha. Don't leave your family for the Yom Tov of Sukkot. Frek gemara eini no v'ha'amar Rabbi Yitzchak minayin shechayev adam lahagbul pnei rabbi b'regel. How do you know that a person is obligated to greet his teacher over Yom Tov? Shenemar, as it says, and this is the haftarah that we read in the portion of Vayera, that the Isha Hashunamis that used to host Elisha got a bracha from him after many years of marriage to have a child. And when her child, Mamish, passed away, right, the story of Tchias HaMesim, so she did not want to tell her husband. She went to find Elisha to tell him what happened. And when her husband saw her going on a journey and knowing that she's going to find Elisha, he asked his wife, Madua atoylechas elov. Hayoim, why are you going to him today? It's not Rosh Chodesh. It's not even Shabbos. From there we learn Bechlal that on Rosh Chodesh and on Shabbos, certainly on Yom Tov, Mechayev inish lakabulei penei ape rabbe. So hold on. So there is an obligation to be Mekabel. So the Gemara says, how does one contradict the other? If your Rebbe leaves in a city where you can go and see him and be with him and come back and spend time with your wife, then you have an obligation. Like Kash, if you can go and come on the same day, then it's a mitzvah, right? We live in LA, go to the oil and come back. Don't leave your family. But if you're not coming back on the same day, Rabbi Eliezer holds that it's not a good thing, because you're missing the v'samachta ato ubeisacha, the importance of staying home. Specifically here, we're focusing on the Yom Tov of Sukkot, where we have the Torah mentioning v'samachta b'chagecha not once but 3 times. Tana Rabbanan. Now, again, we began today's shiur by pointing out Maisa Listoid. We're going to now read a story where it appears that Rabbi Eliezer left his home for Sukkot. Maisa Rabbi Eliezer sheshavas b'golel ha'elyoin. So this Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Eloi, who lived in Kaysari, or who lived in Kaysaroin. He was then, this Rabbi Yochanan was in the Galil Ha'elyon. And guys, the Havamina is Sukah was over Sukkahs, and Rabbi Eliezer was spending Shabbos in his Sukkah. Just to make it clear, we will find out in a moment that, yeah, it wasn't a Sukkah, but it wasn't during the holiday of Sukkahs. Because if not, it's mamash again, Maisa listed. Rabbi Eliezer was the one that advocated, don't leave your family for Sukkahs. But let's begin. So Rabbi Eliezer was a guest in the Sukkah of Rabbi Yochanan ben Rabbi Eloi, and he chamal Sukkah, right? And they're learning throughout the night. Now it's sunrise. The rays of the sun is starting to reach the edge of the Sukkah. Yochanan ben Rabbi Eloi wants to make sure that his teacher Rabbi Eliezer is comfortable. He doesn't want the sun to overheat him, to make him feel uncomfortable. So the way he wanted to afford more shade to his teacher Rabbi Eliezer was by spreading a sheet over the schach. Now, we learned this clearly on Daf Yud. And we learned in Daf Yud another issue, that you cannot do that. Guys, at the end, that's why I'm saying the maskana. This packet did not happen over Sukkot. And as we learned in the Mishnah on Daf Yud, you may not do that. You ruin the kashrus of the schach. But let's shelve that for a moment. Even though now we think this happened over the holiday of Sukkot, but the focus is about it was on Shabbos, and this is going to be a Shabbos question. So again, binyan is one of the lamates malachas. Binyan arai, a building that's only temporary, however that's defined as asun midrabanan. Question is, what happens if you already have a covering, you have an oil, like you have a sukkah, you have schach?
Isn't that considered a temporary fix on your allowance?
Oh, tazoi, that's the question. Oh, you already have a covering, but the covering doesn't completely block the rays of the sun. So you want to add, not permanently, you want to just put a sheet. You want to make a temporary addition over an already existing oil. That's such a minimum upgrade, maybe that you're allowed to do. And that's will be the focus. So Yochanan, wanting to honor his teacher, wanted to know whether he's doing something that's allowed to be done. So Amar Loi, this is Yochanan asking Rabbi Eliezer, am I allowed to spread a sheet over the schach? Again, Rashi makes it clear. We're not focusing on the issue of Sukkah schach, we're focusing on Moisiv al oil arai b'Shabbos. And Amar Loi, and here we have, guys, this is not the first time that we have this, but there are times that a Tana or an Amoira would purposefully deflect a question. So you ask them one question and they give you an answer that's so unrelated. That was the way that they deflected a question that they did not want to answer. And guys, this was the ethics of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, he would not even say one thing that he did not explicitly hear from his teacher. Now, we're not learning Gemara. We're speaking about paskening a din. So he asked them a halacha. Could you or could you not? I want you to know that until today, many big rabbanim, when you ask them a shayla, they don't pasken on their own. They know the din. They show you where to look. Many people, that's a great scholars. They'll put out the Alter Rebbe Shulchan and they'll read it. They're not going to pasken on their own. So in the way he told them, I never heard this explicitly. So Amaloi, so this is how he deflected. He tells them, there wasn't a single tribe amongst the Jewish people that didn't have the schus of having from their tribes fellows a judge. We're speaking about the era of the judges. From the passing of Yeshua up until when Shaul HaMelech was appointed, we are in the era of the judges. Like Rashi writes, their purpose was to save the Jewish people. And Rashi beautifully here goes through the names of many of the shoftim and telling us which shevet they came from, to show you that indeed, kol shevet v'shevet. But Rashi writes with all of his knowledge that from the tribe of Reuven, from Shimon, from Gad, and from Asher, loy motzasi mefurash, I never found explicitly which shevet was from which one of those four. But we know, that's what Rabbi Eliezer tells him, that every single tribe merited to have at least one of their landslide being appointed for that time as a shofet for the benefit of the Jewish people. But he didn't respond to the question. Now, he didn't respond to the question, so Yochanan did nothing. Problem is, guys, we all know that in sunrise, the sun is new. When it goes to midday, guys, when you live in LA, it's Gan Eden. on earth. But when you live, let's say in Florida, it's Taka Gehenim. And the sun, at midday, you can chalish. Now the sun is beating down. Amaloi again, Rabbi Yechanan wants to know, Maush Efesh Sadin, I want to block the sunlight for you. Amaloi, again, he deflects the question by saying, wow, there wasn't a single Shevet Shaliyatzim Benu Neviim. Every Shevet at least had one Navi. And more than that, on top of that, Shevet Yehuda and Shevet Binyamin, Hemidu Malachim al Pia Neviim. They were Zeicha to give the Jewish people kings. As we know, Shaul was from Binyamin and David was from Yehuda. You know, there's the sun beating down on the sukkah, so the temperatures are rising. And then there is when you are sitting in the sun rays. And that's the worst. And when he saw the sun rays already hitting the feet of Rabbi Eliezer, he loved his teacher. He couldn't contain himself. Natal Yochanan Sadin, he took a sheet and he spread it over the schach, and he spread it over the covering. What did Rabbi Eliezer do? He left the sukkah. Hivshil Rabbi Eliezer talisa lachoirav. He draped his cloak over his back, right? And v'yotza, and he left. Now, first of all, why didn't he respond to the question? He wasn't deflecting out of disrespect. Says the Gemara, Loy mipnei shifligu b'dvarim. It wasn't that he was tam deflecting. Ella, like we just quoted, mipnei shalei amar davar shalei shomer mipi rabbi. Lo'olam. He never would paskin something if he did not hear explicitly so from his teacher. So he was basically being asked the question, could you add to already existent oil? And the addition is not permanent. On Shabbos, he never heard explicitly, so he didn't answer, but he didn't want for people to see he's staying there, right? He didn't leave. Is a raya that he agrees that it's okay. He didn't want people to come to that understanding. Now, how did Rabbi Eliezer leave? Right, the Gemara's, the angle is not from the Mishnah Daf Yud. Didn't we learn on top of the Amud Rabbi Eliezer holds you can only fulfill the mitzvah if you spend the whole sukkahs in the same sukkah?
What we say was not sukkah.
That's before we know that. V'ha'amar Rabbi Eliezer ein yotzin misukkah l'sukkah. Now hold on. Prior to that, I have another issue. Prior to that, didn't we learn that Rabbi Eliezer holds that you have to sit in your own sukkah? So, what do people do bepoil with a lulav? We'll speak about this in the next chapter. Not everyone always was able to have the luxury of having their own lulav. So what we do is that we give the lulav as a gift. So it could be that he came to Yechanan. Yechanan, his Talmud, had a couple of sukkahs in his yard, and he gifted one to Rabbi Eliezer. But you can't leave it. So how did he leave? Because no, here the sukkah answers the Gemara. Regel achar havoy. It was not during Sukkahs. It was not during Sukkahs. They were sitting in a sukkah to sit in a fresh air, opened area, not in the stuffy home. This story did not happen over Sukkahs. Here's another problem. That even though we learned above that Rabbi Eliezer praised the lazy people, but as it will become clear that it's not only for Sukkahs. Rabbi Eliezer did not want for a Yid to leave his family for any yontif. I praise the lazy people. They don't leave for any regel their home. How did he go away the regel? So the Gemara says, who says it was a regel? Shabbos Havoy. He went for a Shabbos. Oh, so leaving your house for Yom Tov is much more problematic. Leaving your house if you have to, not being home for Shabbos, that's okay. And now let's chapanayim. Guys, we learned this in Shabbos not that long ago. Shabbos Chafei Amud Beis, and again quoted mamish by the Siyum. Didn't Rabbi Eliezer opine? Guys, do you remember this whole issue? If you have some sort of window shutter, can you put the window shutter in? We learned about that. Frek the Gemara, second to last line. V'tivshit lei mididei. Rabbi Eliezer paskin. He must have heard it from his teacher. The Tanan we learned in Shabbos. A window shutter. Again, you want to know whether you can shutter it on Shabbos. Here also, it's a temporary addition. And Rabbi Eliezer says that the only time you are allowed to do it is if that shutter, prior for it being in the window cover, it's connected both with a string, with a rope, and it's not laying on the ground. It's not laying on the ground. And shekashur, it's suspended. Everyone who looks already sees it being part of the building. Only then can you shut the window, which means v'im la'av ain't poikikin boy. Now, why not? Why not? Because you're being moisev on oil aray. Rabbi Eliezer already gave his opinion. He must have heard it, Mirabah. He should have said no. He should have said no. The Chachamim say ben kach or ben kach. There's a machlekes. What does that mean? But they hold that since it's only a temporary addition, you are allowed to do it. So he gave an opinion. It says the Gemara. Let's just finish Daf Chav Ches. No. Putting a window shutter inside the windowsill, since you could leave it there, so it's being nullified there. That's a greater problem. Hassan hu the mavatal. And that's why it's called moisef. You're adding. Even though you might remove it, but you're adding. Over here, it should be less problematic. It's a sheet. You're not leaving it there. You're only putting it there when the sun is shining in that area. So since it's considered, you can argue, it's not even moisef, there's a reason to say that it should be permitted. Rabbi Eliezer didn't say permitted because he never heard from his teacher permitted. Rabbi Eliezer didn't walk out because he knew it's prohibited. He just didn't want for people to say, aha, you're silent, you stayed there, it's okay. He didn't hear it explicitly, so he removed himself from that scenario, God willing, to be continued. It's good, chevre.